All right, if we're ready, we are super excited to get started on this next panel. Black and LGBT media professionals on the intersection of race and gender sexual identity. My name is Anthony Harrison. I'll be moderating the panel today. I am a proud COM alum of 1981 and super excited to be here. I'm also the most recent president of the Boston University Alumni Association. And I often get asked, yes, that's all the alumni all over the world, all 375,000 of living alumni. I am joined with some amazing professionals who have some very interesting and exciting points of view on this topic. We had a pre-call not too long ago and just had a great time sort of talking and sharing stories. So I'm excited about this panel. I'm gonna let each of them introduce themselves and then we'll jump right into it. So I will turn it over to Femi.
Hi, I'm Femi Redwood. I am a TV and audio journalist with over a decade of experience. I am also the chair of NABJ's, the National Association of Black Journalists, LGBTQ+ Task Force, in addition to a board member at NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists.
I am, is it on?
No, you gotta turn it on.
Okay. How's that? Oh, wow. I'm Tre'vell Anderson. I use they, them pronouns. I am a freelance entertainment journalist, podcast host, authoress of We See Each Other, Black Trans Journey Through TV and Film, which I believe you all are getting a copy of. It's out there on the table out there. And then earlier this week, I published my second book. It's called Historically Black Phrases, From I Ain't One of Your Little Friends to Who All Gonna Be There. I will be doing a book talk for We See Each Other tomorrow, okay, in the Somerville area. I assume you all know what that means. Because I don't. And what else? I host two podcasts. One is called Fanta. It's a pop culture conversation podcast. And then also What a Day, which is a daily news show.
It's hard to follow that. But my name is Whitney Simon. I'm an account director at a B2B tech PR agency in London. I'm also the DE&I lead at our new DE&I consultancy that's going to be launching next month. I am also a board member of the PRCA Race, Equity, and Equality Board. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you again for being here. Femi and Tre'vell, you both are in the media. You're both out there. And so how you present yourself is on display constantly for all to see. Talk to us about the importance of identity, being true to yourself, what it might often be to be the only one in the room, and what it's been like over the arc of your respective careers.
I'm gonna let you start.
Okay, so I think when it comes to being myself, that has shifted over the course of my career. When I started a decade or so ago, I very much wanted to be the type of journalist that I was told I had to be. And throughout my own journey of reporting and then my own gender and sexuality journey, it became clear that that was not possible. Like it wasn't working.
Yeah.
And so now I think being authentic, being myself, showing up in the ways that feel most authentic to me really is an opportunity to show our industry, to show other people who might be interested in this work that you can do it however you are in this world, and still be able to be successful, to get the jobs, to get the opportunities. But it definitely isn't easy. I think, we often talk about being authentic as like, just do it, just like make space and create space. But the reality is that like, you can lose out on a lot of opportunities by being your authentic self. And I'm sure we'll get into that later.
That's actually a perfect segue, because when I started my career, specifically the aspect of losing out on opportunities when you try to be yourself. For those who don't know, I spent most of my career in front of the camera. I've been lucky enough to work in amazing newsrooms, from local newsrooms like News 12 in New York to CBS News and Vice News. So when I started my career in 2006, behind the camera as a glorified PA, basically, the newsroom that I worked at in New York City, I did not feel comfortable being myself. So I was pretending that I was straight, which was interesting in itself, pretending that this girlfriend is really a boyfriend. It was a whole thing. But it took me a couple of months to actually feel comfortable in that newsroom being myself. And so even when I later transitioned to being on TV, when we look at a lot of the Black women on air today, we see more natural hairstyles than we saw 10 years ago. I think sometimes we forget how this industry has evolved leaps and bounds in just the past 5 years. We certainly have a long way to go. But even when I started my career, it was very much you have to straighten your hair or put on a wig or all of these things. And so even though I have amazing natural hair, I've never worn my real hair on camera unless it was straightened. I've worn wigs most of my career. And so when we talk about showing up as our authentic selves at work, it's a journey, it is a journey. I'm now in the audio space, so I don't have to worry about that, but it certainly has been a journey to be who I am now in the newsroom, to be as vocal as I am, to be as out as I am, and to show up like this rather than wearing a Calvin Klein A-line skirt, for example.
Yeah, I hear you. Whitney, you and I have careers more on the quote unquote traditional or corporate side, despite the way we dress today. Talk to me about, again, being the only one in the room and how you found your voice to sort of find your space.
Fatu brought this up in the last panel. So I somehow got a degree in public relations. And I think the reason why I got into it was because I was very passionate about people, understanding people, hearing different stories and telling different stories. I didn't go to BU, so please don't kick me out. I went to Suffolk, and it was really interesting because it was an international college. I was surrounded by people from all around the world, and when I finally got into PR and found out that it was incredibly white, I was very shocked. And so my first couple of jobs were really daunting. Like I have dreadlocks now, but I had an afro, and that was something that, caused a lot of confusion about being a Black woman with an afro. I was engaged at the time, and so I also, similar to you, I'm engaged to a man, and it was very awkward. Like I didn't feel like I could bring my partner to events, and so it was really difficult. And I think my solution to that was moving to the UK. Not to say it's that much better, but I think for me, I've moved to different places in search of a place where I felt like I could be myself, but also through those opportunities, learning more about myself and what makes me different and valuable. And those things aren't bad. And so I think in the past 2 years, I felt really confident in the fact that even though I don't look like most people at my agencies, there are more Black people, but not enough. I have something valuable to say, and people can learn. And I'm meant to be in those rooms, and that's really been great and helpful in kind of showing up as my authentic self.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about it, and we talked about this, like at the start of my career, I brought new meaning to code switching. I mean, it wasn't even a word then. It's like, my goal was to make them forget I was Black and not even think about the fact that I was gay, right? So I was the definition of vanilla, tried to dress like everybody else, kept my hair short, and sort of like tried to fit into a box that, to be honest, was incredibly uncomfortable. And it was only over time that I was like, you know what, like, let me try to find my people, whatever that is. It's a personal journey and a professional journey. And eventually I did, and here's what we have today as a result of it, which
Love it.
We were talking last night about the amount of energy it takes to hold yourself down or hold yourself back. And when you free yourself from that, you can bring all of that energy to your creativity, to your profession. And that was like the light bulb going on. Intersectionality, it's at the core of who we all are as people of color, as queer people, and beyond. I walk in the door and everybody sees I'm a Black man, but they don't recognize immediately that I'm queer. They don't recognize that I'm a first-gen college student. I'm married, and all the other things that make me who I am. How do you think intersectionality and navigating that has impacted each of your careers? Femi, I'll start with you.
I want to start with a heavy sigh, but alas. So when I go into newsrooms, I am showing up as a Black woman, a queer woman, all of these things. So that means that all of those stereotypes that, individuals within those categories have to deal with, I deal with the sum of them. So worrying about someone perceiving me as an aggressive Black woman, even though journalists should have some amount of aggressiveness, but alas. So them seeing me as an aggressive Black woman, them as in news managers questioning whether or not I can cover LGBTQ topics fairly because I am queer. Management worrying about whether or not I can, cover abortion topics. So all of these negative stereotypes are just compounded onto one, which also means that you are having to navigate more than one issue that may come up. I often talk about the one time ever in my career that I've ever gotten written up or ever gotten reprimanded at work. The disciplinary report said Femi makes her coworkers uncomfortable when she talks about racism and homophobia and sexism, which is an insane thing that would be the thing that I would be disciplined on. But it wasn't one of those things. It was the three of those things, because those are the things that I call out because I wear these multiple identities.
I'm still stuck on you saying you only got reprimanded once.
Right?
I was thinking about that too.
Because I was in trouble every week, it seemed like.
But you know what? This is a perfect example. The reason why you were in trouble more is because since I am cis, I am more palatable. Let's be completely honest.
Very true.
Very true. So I got my start at the Los Angeles Times in a diversity fellowship program that they had, and ended up being there for about 4 years. And when I think of this question of intersectionality, that time period also coincided with the unfolding into this fabulous person that you see before you today. But I did not start that way. And so navigating how my identity was showing up on my body in that white newsroom, that white cis, primarily straight newsroom, was interesting. I also was a young person, right, who was using Twitter in a very different way than my colleagues, right? And so I got written up 5 times just for things I said on Twitter, because they don't know how Black people talk. And, other things like that. And so it became kind of this interesting push and pull throughout most of that journey in terms of trying to tell the stories that I was interested in telling, but also like move the newsroom to a space that was welcoming and supportive of someone like myself, not just doing these stories, but also just like existing as a journalist. And so this question of intersectionality, we are often moving through these spaces holding all of these identities in the same ways that our white counterparts and our other non-Black counterparts are as well, to be clear. But often we are the ones who, bear the brunt of the negatives that come with that. Right? Particularly on the journalism side of things, right? Being told that you can't cover a particular thing because you come from that community, being told that, I was told there was a period of time at the LA Times in which we were told we couldn't go to the Pride Parade because it was expressly political. And I said, well, now come on now. This is what happened when you, never mind, I won't say that out loud. But it's situations and instances like that. I remember having to have conversations with my higher ups about how Black Lives Matter is not a political statement. You either believe that I should exist or you don't.
Exactly.
Like, come on now.
Exactly.
And so, but in so many newsrooms, right, Black folks, queer folks, trans folks are having to have those conversations because of how that pushes up against the traditional ways that many of us have been reared in this industry, and the ways that we think of how journalism is supposed to show up.
Exactly.
I think, unfortunately, I spent the first 5 or so years of my career trying so hard to just blend in and make myself small. So I think similar to you, Anthony, I did all that I could to be as white presenting as I could. So trying to like not change my hair too often so people wouldn't comment on it, dressing in the most ridiculous outfits. Like I did not need loafers, not the vibe. And I think I kept making myself smaller and smaller and it still wasn't resonating. I kept getting things like, oh, if I felt as though, or if I made a mistake, or if I, tried to speak up in a meeting, like I would get comments of like, we took a chance on you, like you need to do better. And so I just kept getting all of this feedback that like, your blackness is too much. So to bring out the queerness, I was like, I can't do this. And it was only recently that over time, I just recognized that like the act of trying to be so small and trying to whittle myself down doesn't actually make it any better. And over time, like my mom is also a queer woman. She's married to a woman. Seeing her show up as herself at the age of like 40, and being like, I'm a Haitian woman, I'm a queer woman, it just inspired me to recognize that like, there are going to be people that don't accept all of the different parts of you that make you, and that's okay because you don't need them. And so I think as I got more senior in my career, I recognized that like there is space for me to be all of these different things, and I started garnering more respect for it. Or maybe it was that I recognized I needed to be in different circles. And I think surrounding myself by other queer Black people, that's something that I'm always really keen on when I move to new places, like finding other professional queer Black people that can help show me that I am not that different. Like there are other people like me, and like I have value.
Yeah. To that point, talk to me about allies, like the role allies or supporters have played in your journey, either personally, professionally, the workplace.
Yeah, I think, oh, it's hard. I feel as though most recently in my career, I found myself amongst people who are increasingly recognizing that they need to give space, and people that recognize when in the past that they have been problematic. And I think this did start with George Floyd. I think all Black people can probably attest to the fact that we got so many messages from random people that were like, I think I was racist to you. And interestingly enough, the ones that were true allies were people that were like, instead of being like, have I made you uncomfortable? It's like, I understand this is an incredibly difficult time for you. What can I do to show up for you? And those are the people, I had more than I thought that I actually did, but like I had so many people that were just coming in and saying like, I want to create space, like I'm doing my own learning, I'm not looking to you to do that learning, and showing up at events or creating space for me to talk about my experience and not speaking on my behalf. And it took time, it's unfortunate that it took, the publicized murder of George Floyd for people to start thinking about, oh, wait, like these are things that people have to go through. But it was a moment for me where I really started to see who are the people that are in my corner, authentically, not for props, but like actually want to be there to make sure that I have a space to speak and tell my truth.
Yeah. It when I think about the early years of my career, I didn't have allies because I think I was working so hard at blending that people weren't seeing me, to your point, making myself really small. And there came a pretty significant turning point in my career where I sort of stepped out of corporate and I went to work for a gay AIDS organization, and to a person, all of the so-called mentors in my life said to me, like, it's the end of your career. You're never going to be able to come back to corporate after doing this work. And I was like, okay, thank you for your opinion. And taking that job liberated me because I was in a safe space. I was in a space where I could be myself. I could do my best work. And after being there, I couldn't stuff myself back in that box anymore, right? And so when I came back, I became the person I wished I could see, right? And so I was out, I was loud, I was proud, I was Anthony, and people like resonated with that and kind of came to that. And so I didn't have those allies early in my career, but I became that person as my career progressed. How about on the media side?
I've been lucky enough to have allies, a pretty close-knit group of friends, of which I would consider allies. Where it didn't show up was allies in management. And for my career, that was the important thing. So, for example, going back to the issue I had in the newsroom where I got written up, management, no one, actually sided with me when, I said, well, this co-anchor said this thing. So they didn't side with me then. And then even when I look back on my career and even when I was a general assignment reporter at a local newsroom in New York, there was an issue I had with a police officer. I don't even remember what the story was, but it was something connected to officers not doing something right. And it ended up being a shouting match between me and the officer in the police station. And my photographer, for those who don't know, when you are a TV reporter, you and your relationship with your photographer, like you two are like this. If you two are covering a protest as a reporter, you're making sure they're good. It's just a very close and safely guarded connection you have with your photographer. And in this instance, my photographer said nothing. And then when we left and I went out to talk to him about it, his response was, well, you shouldn't be disrespectful to a police officer, which was insane. Fast forward that to my first job in management where the person who was at that time my brand manager, I launched the podcast department at 1010 Wins, which is the #1 news radio station in the nation. And my brand manager was such an ally that when I spoke to him about, my concerns about, being perceived as the aggressive Black woman, of course, this white man couldn't completely understand everything I said or everything I was experiencing, but he was able to be so much of an ally to give me the encouragement to not do that, where then I was able to lead this department in a way that I would have never imagined, in a way that clearly resonated because we won multiple awards. And so that's the difference between having an ally in management versus not having an ally, is that when you are allowed to be your full self at work, when you know that you have the support of people who may not understand what you're going through, but you have their support, you are truly able to create just amazing pieces of journalism that not only resonates with community members, but also makes you feel good about the work that you're producing.
Allies are great. They've been really cute for me in my journey. But they haven't been transformative. Okay. Largely because I find, in my experience, folks are working so hard to be allies, but they're not willing to put themselves on the line with me, right? And so I often say that we need less allies and more accomplices, right? What are you willing to give up in service of the truth, in service of me being able to do my work in the ways that I need to do it? And the reality is that's where a lot of people's support ends, right? They'll speak up for you when they can, but when they might have to give up their job, right, because they're the old white person who's been in the room for 40 years and it needs to make space for a new, younger, fresh perspective, they're not willing to do it. Right. And so allies have been great in terms of trying to support, trying to make space, trying to be that other voice to the person in management who might not understand. But they have not been out there in the streets with me. They weren't with me when I was going back and forth with the copy desk about using gender neutral pronouns. Right? They weren't, and they weren't, putting themselves, their bodies, their livelihoods on the line in the same ways that we as Black queer folks are often doing when we're in these spaces, right? Because speaking up about, arguing with a police officer, speaking up about something that is problematic in the workplace could lead to us losing our jobs in ways that it won't to them, right? But even in recognizing that, they're not willing to jump into the fray, And so allies are great, they're necessary, but we need more people to move to the space of accomplishment, because that's how we get to transformative change in this industry. That's how we get to a place where we aren't having the same conversations today that, I see Allison Davis in the audience. For those who don't know, Allison Davis is one of the 44 founders of NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists. But we're having the same conversations that they were having 75 years ago, 50 years ago. That's a problem, And if we had more accomplices, right, in the newsroom, I wonder if the conversations would be in a different place now.
That's a really, really good point. Really good point. We are all fortunate, lucky enough to move and operate in big cities, right? London, LA, New York, Oakland. But I find myself still more times than believable, like the only one in the room, or carrying the burden of being the first or being different, unique, the only one, and getting it right, and not being too Black and not being too queer and not being too this or that. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about that burden.
Go ahead, baby.
Do I want to go first? No, I want to hear what Tre'vell has to say, because there's something there. There's something there. Right now, they're trying to decide, how honest do I want to be? I want to hear that.
Okay, so you all should know that Femi and I didn't mention my affiliation with NABJ because I'd be forgetting. But Femi and I have been co-chairs of the LGBTQ task force at NABJ for the last 4 or 5 years, something like that. I'm stepping down, praise the Lord. But I'm also Region 4 director on the national board of NABJ, which basically means I oversee all of the chapters west of Texas. And so Femi knows me. And so she's absolutely correct in terms of me figuring out exactly what I'm going to say to you all.
Just say it. Just say it.
Yeah, just say it.
But there is a burden that comes, like I mentioned earlier, with being yourself and being in these spaces. And I'm going to go further. We've been talking about, kind of white, largely corporate type spaces in terms of newsrooms, but I also mean in terms of Black spaces. Mm-hmm. Right? And I also mean in terms of queer spaces.
Absolutely.
As somebody who is Black, queer, non-binary, and trans. And so, you go into these situations where you know that you're representing a group of people, that you likely are the only one that's showing up in the way that you're showing up, and you have to deal with, various levels of ignorance just to do the task that you are there to do. But the expectation is that you do it anyway, and you push through the discomfort, you push through the pain, the exhaustion, the tiredness, because of what's on the other end, right? Which is, somebody being inspired, which is making space for other people, which is maybe even, making that space more safe, more comfortable for yourself. But we don't talk about the emotional toll of authenticity. We don't talk about the mental deterioration that comes from that work. And we should talk about it a lot more.
And this burden is why so many marginalized journalists leave the industry. It is exhausting being the only one, especially in communities where you shouldn't be the only one. That newsroom that I spoke about, my problematic newsroom, was in Flint, Michigan, which is a predominantly Black city. It should have been a newsroom where I at least felt safe because I'm Black, but that's not the case. And we hear so often when we talk to younger journalists, Black journalists, queer journalists, trans journalists, the reason why they leave after a few years is because they are tired of being the only one. Because when you are the only one, you feel like you have to constantly explain why this happened, this person's reasoning, why this is problematic, and you're already being underpaid. It's like, that is why our industry has such a hard time keeping folks like us in it, because the burden isn't always worth the help that you may provide others.
I totally agree on the PR side as well. I think that the burden of being yourself is something that is completely just underestimated. And then also just in being the only, you end up being this token or this model. So there is no room to make mistakes, and we're all human. But God forbid you're not Black girl magic, or you're not Black excellence, or hell, you've never seen like, you know, one of the top Black movies. Like there are so many expectations when you are the only. And so it's really hard because like we can't live up to these expectations because they're built on faulty stereotypes. So I think that burden is really hard. And I think it's the same in PR. Like you come into this industry that's incredibly fast paced. You're coming in at a junior level. Not only are you getting paid like absolute crap to be like essentially a glorified assistant, but then you also have to speak on behalf of all the Black queer people in the world. And it's like, you do not pay me enough for this, / I don't know. I don't know. So it's a lot. And I mean, a junior person who's just like out of university, I mean, you were talking about 40, 50 years of people trying to do this work. What does like a 21-year-old know about to change your Fortune 500 company so it's not incredibly racist? Yeah. That's not fair. That is not a burden that should be on that person. And yet that is often what I've seen in a lot of corporate organizations and a lot of agencies.
And we should talk about, right, the ways that, you know, you brought up George Floyd, you know, the summer of quote unquote racial reckoning that happened in every industry that gave way to a lot more, you know, DEI type of positions, right, that in theory we're supposed to alleviate the burden of the regular Black person in that newsroom or in that space also having to do the DE&I work for free. But now we're seeing 3 years later that those positions are disappearing. Those people are being the ones laid off first as all of these constrictions are happening. And so, you know, that black box that you posted on Instagram, what does it really mean? Right? Now that the budget is apparently a little wonky, and the first person you let go of is that new DE&I person who was supposed to make this place safer for the rest of us. And so the result of what happens then is that we revert back to that situation in which the Black reporter, the Black publicist, the Black person in this space also has to be, you know, the DE&I individual, and that kind of compounds the exhaustion, the pressure, et cetera, that we're already having to navigate.
Yeah. And what I would just add on that is like, we talk about, you know, they have to be the DE&I person, but then when it all goes wrong, not because it's their fault, because it's a system that is just inherently flawed, they become the scapegoat. Something that I'm always fascinated by is how you put women, you put people of color in these positions to fix an incredibly, pardon my French, fucked up system. And then lo and behold, nothing is fixed. But they are the ones that get like, you know, blamed for the fact that this hasn't changed. We haven't seen things moving forward. And I'm like, hold on a second. These people were just brought in like last minute, 11th hour, but now they are the ones that have to take the burden of the fact that this flawed system is not working.
For eons, as long. A lot of the folks in the audience are students, thinking about what's next, where do they want to work, how to, you know, all of that. What advice would you offer for all students, but particularly queer students, students of color, students, you know, who don't fit into whatever little box the world wants to put them in, as they start their career journey?
Okay. It's not that scary. No, it is. Well, okay. I guess what I would say is you have to remember you deserve to be here. You deserve to be in these spaces. And often you're going to have people that are questioning your validity, questioning your value. There is a level of reminding yourself that what you bring to the table matters and these companies need it. Because obviously we've been dealing with this issue for a long time and it probably going to keep dealing with it. And then what I'd also say is like that does take a toll. It's really hard to constantly feel like you have to prove your worth. So find your people, find your accomplices that are going to be there on the front line with you, putting themselves out there just like you are, and find the other people, the Black queer people, or, you know, the Black non-binary folks, those people that also understand that. Community is so important, and it's something that in every new country that I've lived in, it's the first thing that I do, and it's the only reason why that I've been able to stay at these places, because I found people that saw me for who I was.
Lord, here we go. I'm a big believer in mentorship and guidance. Find a mentor. But that being said, know that everyone who's been in this career for a minute is operating from their own trauma and their own experience. So when your mentors, who are, realistically going to be a bit older than you, they give you some advice that may not sit well with you, whether or not it's, change your appearance, da 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 da. Take what they say, but remix it, because again, just remember that their advice is coming from their decades of experience and their decades of trauma that, like, so many of us are still trying to deal with. So if they say you cannot be on air and present that kind of way, find a way where you can. Maybe that way is TikTok. I mean, let's be honest, TikTok gets more views than some local news stations. So yeah, just find a way to take in what your mentors say, but remix what they say rather than letting it discourage you.
I love that.
Thanks.
The advice that I most often give, that I will repeat today, is be a bad bitch, but be open to critique. Okay? I think that so often for younger folks, for Black folks, for queer folks, for trans folks, we can go into these spaces and have to navigate like a whole lot of imposter syndrome that makes us feel like we don't belong, that we're not worth it, that we don't have the skill set or the talent to be there. And if you are someone who is at the intersection of multiple of those identities, it can be a compounding effect of uncertainty. And so I say be a bad bitch in terms of know that you are necessary in that space, that you bring something that's not already represented there, that you belong there and can contribute to that particular space, but also be open to critique, right? You can always learn something, whether from folks who are, tangential to you, or even from the old head that has been there for 40 years that probably needs to retire at this point, right? You can always learn something, but I lead with be a bad bitch because so often I find that many of us aren't even able to get to the point of doing our best work because we are trying to navigate and deal with other people's perceptions and thoughts about whether we are the diversity hire or not.
I love each of those points, and the one thing I would add is self-care. To take care of yourself, to make the time to take care of yourself, to find the things outside of work that give you joy, that lift you up, that make you feel good, because you're going to need to recharge that battery to do all of the other stuff that we've been talking about.
Can I say something really quickly?
Of course.
To that point. Okay, so I was on the plane recently and I was rewatching Abbott Elementary. Okay, I promise you it relates. And Barbara Howard, woman of God, played by Cheryl Lee Ralph, says in one of the early episodes, talking about how she refuses to burn out because of the necessity of her presence for her students. And it resonated deeply with me as somebody who is always tired of the work that, I'm engaged in. But I also similarly refuse to burn out because of the need, right, to still be present and to transform these spaces. And that's where self-care comes in. I think we are all so committed to the work that we do and we want to transform these spaces, but you will burn out, right, if you allow yourself to. So if you refuse to burn out, that's how you go about prioritizing your self-care to make sure that you can still be here, in 5, 10, 15, 20 years to see the fruits of your labor.
Yeah. And that self-care comes in so many forms. Like I get tired a lot, so I understand. But then I have moments like this panel and my time on campus with students and faculty that I get re-energized and I become hopeful that, the bad guys are not going to win. Yeah, we just have to continue the fight and we just have to keep at it. So I would love to open this up for questions. If, obviously we're not shy about anything. So if there's something in sort of a general nature or more specific nature that you want to ask about? We'd love to hear.
I'm so concerned about the efforts that I could cry. My son is gay. Um, in the public schools, like I'm just going to say it, like what I hear about, in Florida and elsewhere. My son for a while was depressed, and we didn't know why because he was afraid to come out. And my daughter here was the one who helped him because he wouldn't even admit it to anybody. And because we grew up in a town where that didn't seem to be acceptable, I had no idea. And he knew that we would not be judgmental. I've spent much of my life in the area of combating discrimination. And anyway, it's very emotional for me because, literally, he was suicidal. And my daughter suspected this and encouraged him to join a softball team for LGBTQ. It changed his life. He is finally, we can use the H word, he is happy. He has been living with his boyfriend now for a year and a half, and he is so happy. And it terrifies me what these school systems, why are they doing this? I have no idea. What the hell are they afraid of? Because so many kids are going to be depressed. And what can we do about it? And I'm sorry for crying and making this so long.
No. Thank you for sharing that. I think it is, to the point Whitney made, and I second it. It's finding your people, right? Finding your tribe, the people who are going to lift you up and support you and give you the strength to deal with all the other bullshit that's out there that's coming at many of us from many different directions.
I would. Oh no, I was just gonna literally echo that, saying community makes a world of difference. I can't remember which organization I joined first, whether or not it was the National Association of Black Journalists or NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists. But I know that I became more confident in my career once I joined those two organizations, because it's just the idea of having community, having Black journalists that are going to understand what you are going through, Black queer journalists, other queer journalists, but that sense of community can make a massive difference, which is why I say find that community wherever you can. There are, for students here, presumably, is there a student chapter of NABJ or NLG?
I'm seeing no's in the audience.
Okay. Oh, there's not. Okay, so find community.
So y'all should start one.
I was going to say, if it's not there, make it happen.
Yes.
What I would also say is that finding community is really important, but it sounds as though he has a community. Like the fact that you, as his mother and his sister, were able to understand or see that there was an issue and accept him wholeheartedly. Like, I'll be honest, having like a lesbian mom is awesome. She came out before me. So, and I think that has helped me to become more confident and to be a role model for other people, because I saw my mom do it and she was just so unequivocally accepting of who I am. And so I wouldn't underestimate the power of just even having some really incredible family members that are there supporting you and who are looking out for you as well. So yeah, huge kudos to you both, and he's incredibly lucky to have you. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna make a point around, and Whitney and I were chatting about this last night. We all need to learn to destroy boxes and just let people be, right? Like we don't need to label. We don't need people to fit into our preconceived notion. So, you've been on a journey because of your son, but thinking about how do you pivot and take that to other people in your world, right? How do you take that from your family and that sort of openness and acceptance to meet people exactly where they are and not say, oh no, you need to be here because that makes me feel comfortable. Like you can be there because that's good for you and I'll roll with it. And I think that's something that we can all do to help build community, even if we can't identify that someone is in pain or dealing with something. We can give all people the room to be whoever they are. Other questions?
The question that I have is really about Black queer representation in Black media, because people keep talking about the summer of 2020 and George Floyd, and sometimes they might mention Breonna Taylor when it comes to the intersection of gender, but we rarely hear people talk about Tony McDade, who is a Black trans man who was also killed by police within days of George Floyd. I don't see it did not see Tony McDade come up in and I'm not trying to name check any places, but like Essence, Ebony, like the typical players that we think of when we think of these entities that always are covering us. So what needs to happen? What are some of the like immediate steps that Black media can take to be more inclusive of our queer siblings across the spectrum?
I'm going to tell Tre'vell to take this because, well, no, in all seriousness, this is something that they talk about a lot and has some personal experience. All hail Tre'vell.
You know, I think
Just say it.
we as Black folks, and therefore our Black media, are dealing with our own shit, by which I mean, you know, so many of those publications are still trying to be, you know, their parents' publication, by which I mean, you know, not identifying or recognizing the need to talk about Black queer issue, Black queer visibility, Black trans visibility, and the experiences that we are having, especially, you know, there is something that you said, ma'am, that I'm gonna bring up here. You know, so there is I promise I'm gonna answer your question, Sherry. So there's this statistic that GLAAD has. GLAAD is this like media monitoring organization, LGBTQ representation. There's a statistic that they have right now that's like 70% of people say they've never met a trans person in real life. And GLAAD uses that statistic to talk about the necessity of images of trans people on screen as a result, because if people have not met a trans person, that means the ways that they're learning about us is through the film and television that they're getting. I like to say that 70% believe they've never met a trans person, but they believe they've never met a trans person because they have not made the community around them safe enough for the trans people who are already there to tell you their truth. Okay? Because trans people, we all over the place. Okay? We all up in this room. You just don't know it. It's not just me. Okay? And so when I think about Black media specifically, and the ways that Black media can be more inclusive in representing the vastness of the Black experience, that's what comes to mind for me. And part of that is getting us to a point of realizing that, you know what? Transness doesn't have to be an acceptable thing in your Bible for you to feel that is important for you to capture the truth of our lives in your pages. You know, I don't, especially as journalists, as media makers, right? We are told often that whatever biases that we have, whatever personal feelings that we have about a story, that we should be able to, you know, check that, right? But when it comes to Black media, we don't often think about the ways that we don't check that same set of biases when it comes to trans representation, when it comes to queer representation. And so I say that it is important for everyone here, everyone, no matter the type of work that you do or are interested in doing, that you are looking at who is not represented in that room, who is not represented in that space, and doing everything that you can to bring those people into the conversation. What would it look like for any of these Black media publications to have an LGBTQ editor? Not somebody who is LGBTQ, but somebody whose beat it is, right? To look at the particular intersections of Blackness and LGBTQ identity. None of them have it. I mean, to be clear, a lot of the mainstream ones don't have them either, right? And so we're fighting a losing battle. But the reality is that our lives are a lot more complex than most of the media that is out there that is supposed to represent it, both from a Black standpoint, also from a Black queer standpoint. And when we can realize that, and put the vastness of our Black experience on the pedestal ahead of, a very particular individual type of Black experience. I think that's how we get to a space where our media is more reflective, and that the ways that we go about remembering these pivotal moments in our history are as inclusive as possible, taking into account a Tony McDade or Breonna Taylor right alongside George Floyd's killing as well.
So help me navigate the space of, we want to be valued for all the things that we have, but we're sometimes expected to advocate for those things. So that's what I heard up here. We get tired. How do we live in both of those spaces? We can't change who we are, but everybody wants us to then be that poster person for that.
I'm not sure I understand your question. Maybe it's just me. Do you understand it?
So we represent a race, we represent sexual orientation, and we say we want you to value that. But then we also hear we get tired of always having to advocate in those spaces.
Well,
I think the problem is management or leadership, because if there were more of us, or leadership were equipped to, explain why you need to use this term, why you need to, frame a story this way, then the work wouldn't fall on us. I don't want to speak for anyone, but I think it's safe to say that, for me, I love my Blackness, I love my queerness, I love being a woman, and I talk about these things all day long. But when I don't feel like talking about it, if I want to talk about something stupid like how horrible the new Sex and the City is, I want to be able to. And news management needs to then be able to have that conversation and say, okay, according to the Transgender Journalists Association, you should use this term instead of this term. According to, I don't know, I can't think of anyone else right now, you should frame a story this way and that way. So it's not that we don't want, again, don't want to speak for anyone. It's not that we don't want to share our experience or sometimes be the voice of reason. We just don't want to do it all the time.
Or be the only one doing it, right?
be the only one doing it.
To the point about accomplices, right? Other people who may not be part of these communities speaking up and saying, wait, that's not right. We should be thinking about this differently. We should be talking about this differently, as opposed to someone from one of those communities always having to be the one to check everybody else.
Like what I often say, sorry, one last thing, is think about any local newsroom. Forget the national news, because most people trust local news more than national news, but even national news, honestly. But think about any local newsroom. How many trans journalists or anchors do you see on air? What would a newsroom look like if there was at least one trans person on air in that community? Then the burden wouldn't be on, the few of us that are queer.
I mean, I think the difference, there's a difference between acknowledgement and exploitation, right? And when we are often the only person in a space, and we are comfortable and open and want to talk about the truth of our identities and how that impacts the work that we do. The point you made about when I'm not feeling it, right? When I'm not in that mood, I want to be able to not do that and not that be seen as some sort of violation of my place in that space. But also it should not be your or the other party's expectation that I will do that work or that anyone will do that work, right? There are some Black people, some Black queer people who don't want to talk about their identities. They're not interested in being, your Rosa Parks or whatever, right? They just want to be there. They want to, cover gaming or something, right? Outside or beyond of their beyond their identities. But what we find most often is they're not able to. Right? They're forced to speak up for, the all Black folks, all queer folks, all trans folks. And so the idea is, to move from a space of exploiting, what we love about ourselves and what drives us to do this particular work, and move to a place of acknowledging it, right? And then, I'll go a step further. If you are going to want or expect, that Black person, that queer person to do that type of work, that type of advocacy, pay them. Because, a check will change a lot of people's feelings about talking about a lot of things, me included. Just say it.
Hi. I obviously can't speak to the Black experience, but I know that, like, if you're a queer person and you happen to have a passive nature about you, you're kind of screwed. So I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what our responsibility is in spaces where we are, you know, newsrooms where we might be the only queer person or, you know, one of the only queer people. Like, how much is it our responsibility to do something, say something, change something? Yeah.
I don't work in a newsroom, but what I would say is that you don't have a responsibility to speak on behalf of all queer people. As they were just saying, you know, if that's something that you feel passionate about, I also feel really passionate about talking about the fact that I'm Black, that I'm queer, all these other things. I do that because it brings me a lot of joy to like think about a future where other people that are like me like feel as though they're seen. But I don't do it, or at least now I do not do it because I feel like that is the expectation of me. And I think that's really important. It kind of talks to the point about self-care. Like, we are not just here to just be talking heads for the experience of all diverse people. If that's something that you want to share, if you want to talk about and you feel moved to, definitely. But also, like, you know, if you feel tired, if you don't feel safe, or if it's just not true to your nature, that doesn't make you any less of like a good queer person. It just means that you're allowed to be you because you have that right to be you and not have to be, you know, the token whatever.
I also think hearts and minds change one person at a time, and having a professional or personal relationship with one other person in your newsroom or in your organization where you move them on their journey, that maybe they can speak when you're not in the room, that's just as important as sitting up here on a panel and spouting off the way we're all doing, right? And, you know, change comes in big and small increments. And I think being being the person that you're most comfortable being will have a ripple effect with the people around you. So it doesn't have to be big and loud all the time, despite us.
I would just add that your only responsibility is to survive. And so you do whatever you have to do to survive these spaces that we find ourselves in. And if that's being quiet and letting the foolish racism unfold, then like your duty is to survive. Your duty is to be able to go home every day and take care of your own personal community. Period. And to what Whitney was saying, you know, I think that, you know, there are ways that even if it is not your personality to be the biggest, the loudest, the most, you know, performative or whatever, I think there are ways to also not be a hindrance to progress. You know, you can be silent, you can be meek, you can be to yourself and be complicit in the violence that takes place in a particular space. And you can also be meek and mild into yourself and also push back in the ways, you know, that are necessary for that space. And so I think it's about figuring out what works for you. Right. And it might not look like everybody else's, you know, advocacy or everyone else's speaking up. Right. Maybe you're the person that's like, oh, that was a really bad situation, really awkward. I'm going to go to that person who made that infraction directly one-on-one after the meeting and just be like, you probably shouldn't have said that. You know, I'm not going to make a big deal. I'm the person who's going to make a big deal about it in the meeting. I'm going to stop the meeting and we're going to address this right now. But everybody's not that. And that's okay. We all have kind of our role that we can play in this fight for liberation. Right. And so I think it's just about figuring out what feels right to you. But ultimately, your only responsibility and duty in this world that we are living in is to survive, particularly and especially if you are a person that comes from some sort of marginalized background.
Well, thank you. This has exceeded my expectations in terms of the quality and passion. I knew we were going to have fun up here, and I really did. and I enjoyed. And I hope it's been helpful, useful, enlightening for all of you. Thank you so much for listening and participating and being part of this whole symposium, and particularly this particular panel. So thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists. We are going to break for lunch right now.